and welcome to the Scituate Historical Society GAR Hall Special Events Zoom Edition. We're very excited to have everyone here tonight, and we're excited to have Anthony back with us again. He was a regular favorite when we were live in person, which hopefully soon we will be again. We've got some great stuff coming up in the next few months. I'm not going to get into details or anything, but we've got a presentation on Bathsheba Spooner, and we've got a trip to Mount Kilimanjaro, and we have got a presentation on the Boston Maritime Underground Railroad and the women of the Boston Underground Railroad. So, and then we've got the Red Sox, and we've got a couple of other things too, but if you want to know everything that's going on, send me your email. If you're not on the email list, I'll get you on there. Check out our Facebook page, Scituate Historical Society. We post regularly and you'll be in the know. As you know, we don't charge for any of these presentations, and we do appreciate donations if it's possible. If not, don't worry about it, but they are greatly appreciated. So now I'm not going to hold you up anymore because we all want to hear about the wonderful Easter traditions in Boston. And I will, those of you who don't know, Anthony Samarco. So Anthony, I'm going to have you share your screen and off we'll go.
Well, I want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for inviting me. Zoom is a thing that not only I used at Boston University last semester to teach my students on the history of Boston, but it's something in a lot of ways that we've come to somewhat rely on over the last year. And I think in some ways during COVID, I've not really gone to any lectures or any concerts, but I think in some ways I've actually been able to write quite a few books. Over the last 1 year, I've written 11 books, and they go the gamut from through time books of both Back Bay, Beacon Hill, East Boston, Jamaica Plain, Mission Hill, Mattapan, as well as Brighton and Allston. And we realize in some ways that these are a continuation of the books that I had written for Arcadia. But one of the new types of books that I've been doing are the tradition series in Boston. About 1.5 years ago, I wrote Christmas Traditions in Boston, and last fall came out Thanksgiving Day Traditions in Boston. So this Easter Traditions, which only recently came out last month, is like the previous ones and the book on Valentine's Day Traditions that I recently finished that'll be out for Valentine's Day in 2022. Each one of them are shared memories, the things that we remember as Bostonians of not only what our families did, both on a religious as well as secular basis, to celebrate Easter. And seen here on the cover were 3 young girls covetously looking at their Easter baskets filled with all sorts of candy and eggs. And we realized in the 1950s, they not only wore bonnets, which is something I wish children would actually resume doing today, but we also realized in some ways that it was a tradition that many children would wake on Sunday morning on Easter and realize how important it really was. The book itself is not just secular, but I do start the first chapter, and I call it Ecce Homo, and it talks about the week that Jesus would have led from the period of Palm Sunday right through to Easter Sunday when he rose from the dead. And seen here, Christ carrying the cross, which was painted in 1505, is a great example of Christ walking the steps that would lead to eventual crucifixion. These realistic paintings, mind you, this is over 500 years old, give in some ways the turmoil and travail that Jesus must have actually entailed in that period. And we realize that these are an important way in some aspects, looking at religious paintings to realize, of course, Easter is a religious holiday, but in the United States, it has evolved into something that is more secular, even though one might be a Roman Catholic or a Protestant. But seen here, during that week, we have Christ before the high priest, painted in 1617. And it shows Jesus being interrogated with Roman soldiers in the distance about his teachings. and the purported false testimony that was called against him. Well, in this instance, Jesus himself was someone not only was condemned to death, but here with Jesus with the crown of thorns painted in 1635 shows in a very artistic manner maybe the resignation of Jesus Christ, crowned with thorns and of course covered in a red cape. We realize in this instance this is showing Jesus in a nighttime scene of torment, illuminated by a single candle by the man held on the right. And we begin to realize that the light and the dark are the good and the evil, not only in the world in this period and 1635 when it was painted, but even today. Christ with Thorns was painted by a man named Karl Bloch. He was a German painter, probably thought to be one of the finest religious painters of the 19th century. And it again shows Jesus with the red cape as well as the crown of thorns. We realize in this instance, when we go through the entire Holy Week services, how important it was leading up to Good Friday. And this, the Christ crucified, painted in 1632 by Velázquez, is something that shows the culmination of his interrogation and, of course, Pontius Pilate offering to the people. And this is a painting that actually shows a gentle halo above his head. And you begin to realize on this wooden cross, not only did Jesus die for our sins, but in this instance, he fulfilled the prophecy and he would ascend from death. The resurrection, also painted by Karl Bloch in 1881, shows Jesus emerging from the stone tomb. And we realize on Sunday morning, he is risen. Jesus is victorious over death, and he emerges from his tomb with adoring angels and the white lilies, signs of purity that surround him. Well, in this instance, religion is paramount, but it's also the fact that we begin to realize that in the period of the 17th and 18th century in the New World, Easter was not celebrated. They had already banned Christmas legally in 1655. But in the early part of the 18th century, we began to realize, with a more tolerant aspect towards religion by the King of England, that it was something that began to see the allowance of the worship on Easter Sunday morning. Now, James II, who would have also been James VII of Scotland, was King of England and Ireland, and we realized in this instance his religious tolerance was an important feature because the colonies had been settled by Puritans. Puritans were Englishmen, and they wanted to purify the Church of England from within. And by purifying that church, it meant no vestments, no crucifixes, no crosses, no candles, and of course, no incense. So it removed all of the trappings of Roman Catholicism. Well, during the 17th century, Boston would have not only the Old North Church and of course the Old South Church, but the first and second churches of Boston. Well, the King and Queen, William and Mary of England, would appoint this man, Sir Edmund Andros, as the royal governor. He was not only the royal governor, but he became the governor of the Dominion of New England. During that period, he was the representative of the King and the Queen in the New World. And as he was an Anglican, as the King and the Queen were the titular heads of the Church of England, he decreed that on 1688, there would be an Easter celebration at the Old South Meeting House at Washington and Milk Streets in downtown Boston. You can imagine, the Puritans were aghast. This was their place of worship. This was something that had removed all of the trappings of the Church of England, but in this instance, their church was commandeered, and the bell was tolled for all Anglicans in Boston. And this would begin to realize it was the aspect of the diversification and acceptance of other religions in Boston. During this period, we saw not just the Puritans, but we see Anglicans, Roman Catholics, Huguenots, and many others, including Quakers and Baptists. Well, in that instance, some people, and this is my ancestor, Samuel Sewall, who was a judge in the province of Massachusetts Bay and one of the judges of the Salem witchcraft trial, was someone who not only blotted out every religious holiday in his diary, but he was a holdout even as late as 1730 when he died, that he would still not celebrate Easter or Christmas. Well, many people were bigoted and ignorant, but it was the fact in some ways that their religion had actually been carved out of something that they had turned into the Puritan faith. Well, it really wouldn't be until the 19th century when we began to see Boston diversifying because of immigration and, of course, matriculation. Through immigration, we had not only a new thriving nexus of ethnicities, new culture, but we also began to see people bringing with them new religions and, of course, the aspect of the celebration of Easter. One of the families that would actually come here were the Prangs, and this is Louis Prang. Prang was a German immigrant. He came here in 1848, and he actually was a lithographer. He was extremely adroit and well-versed in all printing matters. And during the period of the 1850s and 1860s, he simply printed whatever one needed, stationery, business cards, anything of that sort. But by the late 1860s and 1870s, he introduced the first Christmas card in the United States. But by the period of the early 1880s, he was printing Easter cards. Now, Louis Prang was said to be one of the finest printers, not just of the 19th century, but of the entire period from 1630 to the present in Boston. And seen here with Jesus, with a wreath of Easter lilies surrounding him, we began to realize that his chromolithograph process was something that not only produced colorful cards, but we realized that they were among the most expensive in the process. A chromolithograph had a stone that was carved, and then it would be dipped into one color. There would be 8 or 10 stones carved so that each one overlaid to create this colorful card as you see. Not only were they labor intensive to prepare, but they were labor intensive to print. But Louis Prang had a factory, and it still stands on Roxbury's Meeting House Hill. And here he employed over 120 men and women with a ratio of about 60% women to 40% men. And he produced not just greeting cards, but he also produced Christmas cards, Easter cards, 4th of July cards, Halloween cards, and even Valentine's Day cards. And in that way, many of his artists who worked for him would create things during the Victorian period that many people perceived were not just beautifully done, but they were a statement of the period. Now, this is just after the time of the Civil War. And you see it's a cross, it's a religious card, and it has white lilies. But they called it the Easter Lily Cross, and surprisingly, it was designed by a woman named Olive Elizabeth Springer Whitney. She was one of the over 70 women that were employed at Louis Prang's factory. They did not only coloring, and they did cutout and design, but they also did entries, which would actually be in the entry of the card. But this was lilies of the valley as well as the Easter lilies themselves. And these women in some ways created cards that were the equal of anything being done by men throughout the country. This is a card I acquired a few years ago, and it's one of my favorites, and it says it's the angel at the tomb of Christ. Now, as a chromolithographic card, you can see the number of colors that were necessary to create that wonderful colored card. But in this way, Louis Prang shows an angel holding a palm frond and a trumpet outside the open tomb of Jesus Christ. The two angels have disappeared. They've proclaimed he is risen. But in this way, the palm frond is a symbol of victory, triumph, peace, and eternal life. Christ is risen, and on the rock you begin to realize this was an important feature, not just in our religious readings, but also in Prang's cards. Prang would also use the flowers of spring, something that he thought were not just beautiful, but also gave a connotation. You've probably heard many Victorians perceived flowers to have special meanings. Well, this was the bells of Easter, and it was printed in 1881 with blue bells. It was said to be a flower long associated with the everlasting love and constancy. And bluebells are said to be a favorite with the woodland fairies and were a sure sign that spring had arrived. This was something that not only did he create a card, but the hymn that is actually placed on the front is actually something that was composed by Dmitri Bortyansky. So he was using not just scripture readings and choral readings, but he was using the language of flowers. Well, in that latter part of the 19th century, Louis Prang wasn't the only man printing cards in North America. Many were actually doing them as anonymous lithographers. And here we have an Easter bunny with a basket on his back holding colored Easter eggs. And he holds a cane of pussy willows. It was thought in the Germanic tradition that, of course, it was the Easter bunny that would bring the eggs. And we realized that children would love these, and they became synonymous during that period with the influx of Germans coming to the New World. And seen here, it wasn't just the fact that the Easter bunny was bringing the eggs, but in this one, again, an anonymous colored card, we see a chick hatching from an Easter egg. So this concept of the Germanic tradition that Louis Prang had introduced with chromolithography is now being introduced into these cards that children can relate to. Well, in many ways, cards were done throughout the latter part of the 19th and all of the 20th century. Many people would actually do them and become quite well known. This is a photograph of Tasha Tudor. She was actually the great-granddaughter of the Ice King, Frederick Tudor, the first man to cut ice and not only provide it for warm climates, but he made a fortune. She herself was someone who would dress and act in the period of the 1830s, and she's in front of a portrait of her great-grandmother, Euphemia Tudor. But the idea was Tasha Tudor wrote books, and they were primarily about her dogs that were corgis. But one of the books she wrote was on Easter, and seen here, she would do these paintings that were actually done in watercolor, and they show the children, possibly her own, not only with a tree, but decorated with all sorts of eggs. It wasn't just chicken eggs and hen eggs, as well as duck eggs, but even at the top, she would have robin's eggs and plover eggs. And this was something that was not only written about, but it was something that she had experienced and, of course, introduced to her children and later her grandchildren. These cards, in some ways, and books were things that many people read. They were wonderfully illustrated, but many of the cards of that period were types of things that were done not only as a sentimental card, but they would actually show the artwork of known artists. On the left-hand side is Norman Rockwell, probably one of the greatest painters of 20th century America. He seemed to chronicle middle-class American life, and he's speaking with Joyce Hall. Joyce Hall was the man who would eventually found Hallmark cards. Do you remember the term, when you care to send the very best, one would send a Hallmark card? Well, Joyce Hall had a stable of artists, including even Winston Churchill, and each one of them would produce a card that could compete to become the card of the year, whether it was for Easter or Thanksgiving or even Christmas. Well, this was one that was done by Norman Rockwell in 1957. It shows a father seated in his Eames chair reading the newspaper, smoking a cigarette and drinking a cup of coffee. I guess he's not going to Sunday church with his wife and 3 children, but the children parade behind him with their bonnets, wonderful Easter outfits, and the little boy on the right-hand side kind of side glances at his father. But look closely at the father. Not only do we see the cigarette smoke coming from behind the newspaper, but Norman Rockwell actually made small horns in his hairstyle. So we begin to realize that not just a religious card, but a secular card that evokes a sense of merriment, something that we could actually identify with. But he also began to realize that a man by the name of Winslow Rust was the man who would actually create Rustcraft cards. By the mid-20th century, there was Rustcraft, Hallmark, there was Gibson cards, and all sorts of different things that were done, not just to produce a card that could be sent, but also something in some ways that you could actually maintain contact with family and friends that you hadn't seen for years. Well, this Rustcraft card, done by a woman named Mary Cooper, who actually was with Rustcraft for over 50 years, sent Easter greetings to a special friend. Well, it's an adorable kitten coming out of a tall-ware teapot. And these were things that people looked forward to. And every year, like Louis Prang, who had both men and women, each of these new companies would actually employ a cadre of workers that might be printers, colorists, as well as the people who wrote the verses. It was important, but you began to realize that even Norcross cards, again, names that do not become in some ways a name that we use anymore because they merged into one another 30 years ago, would actually produce some of the finest cards. And this was the founder of Norcross Cards, and one of hers in 1930 was an Art Deco Easter lily. And you can see this beautiful card, which was done in a shiny fabric. It was actually satin, and Easter is there along with the white Easter lily. Each of these cards were not inexpensive. Louis Prang's cards could actually bring as much as $1 in the 1880s and 90s. But by the period of the 1930s to the 1950s, no longer were the cards chromolithographed, now they were printed. And by printing it, a card could be had for less than 15 cents. But it wasn't just cards. Easter was something, again, that connotated in some ways the idea of the Easter bunny bringing the eggs. Well, I keep chickens at our place in Austerville on Cape Cod, and I do color Easter eggs every Easter. But the whole idea was, by the 20th century, we now had even people such as Flex that produced colors that would actually produce a color that you could place on the Easter egg. I love this box. This is a box in my collection, and it shows an Easter bunny in a top hat, cutaway, and spats, actually showing you the different colors that were available. Well, Flex had started as early as 1889 in a color scheme company, but by 1910 they were producing Easter egg colors. They were marketed throughout the United States. Well, what did you do with them? Well, Flex would encourage you to actually have different glasses in front of you, each one which was colored with the small die that was placed in the kit. In the foreground, you can see uncolored eggs. But look at the artist. Do you see the chick on her shoulder? Well, that chick is telling her how to color the certain eggs. And you began to realize, yes, it was done for children and grandchildren, but a colored Easter egg was something that was so synonymous with Easter that many people realized by the 1950s and 1960s that now there was a company called RIT that produced an Easter egg coloring kit, all for 29 cents. You may not remember, but I do. My mother would actually use RIT dye to dye shoes to actually match a ball gown or a dress that she was wearing to a wedding. But RIT coloring kits was something that allowed you, as you can see here with all of the different colors, but you can see here they also had Easter egg dress-ups for the moon visit. So we know this is 1967. Well, what do? They would actually color them day and night so that children could actually have their colored eggs in the morning, along with chocolate Easter bunnies and chocolate eggs. Well, this is an advertisement. If I was coloring dozens of Easter eggs, I'd want a Smirnoff daiquiri myself. And seeing here, you can realize in some ways, in the foreground, you see the wonderful basket filled with edible chocolates, but you realize all these different colors were so important. Well, seeing here, these are two little munchkins in the center who actually live in Scituate. You have to realize in some ways, this is a photograph of my mother's very best friend's great-grandchildren. This woman went to school with my mother from day school all the way through Vassar. And the children are actually from left to right, William Heffernan, James McLean and Catherine McLean from Scituate, and Charlie Heffernan, along with his twin brother from Milton. This is, again, something that shows you the past die kit, something, again, that allowed you to color each of these eggs in a perfect way so you too could have a colorful Easter basket on Easter morning. Well, the whole idea of Easter, especially when our mothers and grandmothers were going to church, was to choose an Easter bonnet. And seen here, this is a photograph of the late 1940s, and this woman has a plethora of hats to choose from. In this instance, she shows a straw hat with straw flowers and a veil, but she has dozens of hats, and it didn't matter where that hat came from. It could have been a hat shop, but also W.T. Grant and Woolworths had Easter hats as well. Hats were an integral figure, and seen here, this is a woman, Mrs. Lemire, who lived in Milton. I acquired this on eBay, and she's actually sitting in a hat shop in Quincy Square that was actually, I want to say 1961 or 62. Her little boy in the foreground is actually trying on a lace and flower hat himself. But many people took this as a very serious thing. These hats were an important feature that allowed many people not only to dress up for the holidays, but to make a statement. This woman, and this is a photograph from 1953, is not only beautiful in a polka dot silk dress, but her hat has plastic straw and a live duck. I don't know how well that went over in church on Easter Sunday morning, but you began to realize it could have been a little bit of a quacking aspect, but her friends in some ways, the Hat sisters from Boston and Providence, Rhode Island, on either side of the late Thomas Menino, mayor of Boston, took hats to a new height, beautiful flowers. So whether it was a veil or a hat with actually flowers or something that you realized in some way was so unique, you could actually wear it to services. But where were the services? Yeah, most of us would have gone to church, but many services were sunrise services. And this is a sunrise service in 1937 in Melrose, Massachusetts. This was something during the period of almost an evangelical aspect that many people looked at Easter services as something that were an important feature, not only to rise with the sun, but also to realize that the rising sun was when we knew that Jesus had risen from the dead. In that way, this on a top of a large hill, which was actually an ecumenical Easter sunrise service, was on Mount Hood in Melrose, and it was actually sponsored by WEEI CBS Radio. Thousands of people, but in the very recent past, one might have gone to South Boston's Castle Island. And seen here is the Donald McKay monument, the monument to the man who actually perfected the clipper ship in East Boston. But hundreds of people would come to an open air religious service as a Roman Catholic Mass. So whether it was ecumenical or Roman Catholic, sunrise services are something in a lot of ways that allow us to commune not just with nature, but to the aspect of Christ rising from the dead was integral. Well, in a lot of ways, yes, many people did go to church. And in this book, I do show some wonderful pictures. This is Trinity Church in Boston's Copley Square. It's the oldest Episcopal place of worship in Boston, founded in 1732. But you began to realize that these churches, including, of course, here, the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston South End, along with flowers on the altar, as well as, of course, the magnificent architecture, and, of course, this. This is really one of the things that I began to realize when I did this book, how many photographs that I would acquire on eBay. They said Easter offerings, and of course they showed church school classes. Well, this was the Union Square Baptist Church on Walnut Street in Somerville, and two women on either side of this enormous mounted board hold wands that were electric wands. And what they did was to call this Our Book of Golden Memories Easter Offering. And what they did was to call out one's name. And you can see on the upper left-hand side, it said Cradle Row. And the first one was Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet would stand and in front of the congregation would say, I pledge $10. They'd then call on Mrs. James, and she pledged $5. it sounds like they were badgering people to give money because we didn't want to appear cheap. I don't know about you, but I've actually even ripped a dollar bill in half so I have money for the first and second collection. But in this way, it was a way that people gave offerings, and it was an electric cross. And these two women, who were known as Greta Long on the left and Beatrice Metz, were called the church angels. Well, Easter Sunday would eventually lead to the parade. And the Easter parade in Boston in the 20th century was one of those things that brought people of all walks of life, all ethnicities, all religions, and all races. And seen here, this is actually outside of a church in Boston South End. A man stands there in a beautiful top coat and, of course, his hat, rep tie, and morning trousers, bringing his granddaughter with her small little bunny on the way to the Easter parade. Well, the Easter parade was something that many people realized was only a once-a-year occurrence. And seen here, of course, this is something that showed a mother, her sister, her daughter on the left-hand side, and the son to the right. This was something in a lot of ways that made people realize that the Easter parade on Commonwealth Avenue was a morning aspect. Just after services, and they were on Berkeley Street in downtown Boston, they're probably leaving Trinity Church, walking to the Commonwealth Avenue Mall. But as many people realize, these were people who had their clothes, a fur-topped coat, corsages, and of course the man in a top hat and cutaway. These were things that brought people to the Commonwealth Avenue Mall, not only to see, but to be seen. This is a photograph that I really do like. It's from 1940, and on the right is Christian Herter. He was Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, but he would later become the governor of the Commonwealth, his wife and their son and daughter. And you realize in this instance, not only do they live on Commonwealth Avenue, but you realize many of these people were coming every single year to parade. And what did they do? Well, they came in their very best. I love this photograph. Granted, the mother has this silver-tipped fox fur stole, and her young daughter looks lovely in her coat and hat and gloves. But look at her sons on the left-hand side. These are sons that are wearing dapper morning coats, Eton collars and rep ties, boutonnieres, and miniature top hats. Their stiff Eton collar can actually be removed, but it was the quintessential fashion statement for young men, such as children, as well as in their 20s and 30s, to dress in the Eton collar. Well, many people that came were not Brahmin. Many people were said to be people of everyday life. And during the late 40s and 1950s, there was a family called the O'Neills. They lived in Jamaica Plain, and Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill, seen here on the left-hand side, seemed to produce a daughter a year. Their daughters were beautifully dressed in clothes that she made for them every year. And if you notice, Mrs. O'Neill's even wearing a mature outfit compared to her daughters. They had matching hats, matching coats, matching handbags, and they might differ from the younger girls wearing white socks with the black shoes and the older girls wearing high heels. But Mrs. O'Neill was said to be sewing from Easter of the previous year all the way to Easter of that year. And I can imagine with 12 outfits to make, as well as 2 for her sons. But she would continue it every single year. And this is 1957, showing the O'Neills in the Easter parade on Commonwealth Avenue. It's something you began to realize she must have been so proud of her daughters. But I commend her daughters because they didn't buck their mother. They went along with it. And as they became older, the older ones would become married, and one daughter did take devotions and she became a nun. But as you can see here from left to right, Jane O'Neill Deary and Barbara O'Neill Wampole and Maureen O'Neill Clunan are all married. Then there's Evelyn, Virginia, Mary, Julie, Danielle, Frances, and Daniel O'Brien Jr. Mrs. O'Neill, with her Stone Mountain furs, must have been very proud. And you realize in this instance, that they weren't the only family that actually dressed up for Easter and in matching outfits. The other family were the Houghtons, and the Houghtons came from Somerville, Massachusetts. Mrs. Houghton is on the left-hand side and Mr. Houghton on the right-hand side with his young son. They actually hired a seamstress who would actually make the outfits for her. Maybe she didn't like to sew. But the whole idea was that Maureen Houghton Foster, who was a friend of mine on Facebook, said that she remembered in the beginning, my mother made our outfits. However, as more children were added to the family, that became more difficult. So my mother found an elderly seamstress who lived in nearby named Mrs. Church, and we would go to her house to discuss the outfits and be measured. And I remember going into Chinatown with my mother to purchase the fabric. Well, the O'Neills, by the period of this, which is 1967, actually allowed a little bit of a difference. The seamstress made these coats that actually had a cape, white gloves, white hat, handbag, shoes, and maybe white socks. This was something that many people must have looked forward to. I know the newspapers did because these were newspaper photographs that I acquired from eBay, from the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald and the Boston Post. But it's something you realize that Easter Sunday's parade was something that was not only special, but it followed not only opening our Easter baskets and attending services, but also taking a walk. Well, I showed you the cover of the book. It was this black and white photograph. I have a magnificent publisher in London by the name of Alan Sutton. His young son, Jamie Sutton, colorized this picture. And we realize these three cherubic young ladies not only stare at their Easter candy, but they're so indicative of the period of the 1950s. Easter candy was an important thing, so weren't Easter egg trees. Now, previously we saw Tasha Tudor's Easter egg tree, but this was a photograph that I acquired from the Brookline Public Library in 1950. And it shows children in the reading room, and it's an Easter egg tree with a copy in the foreground of the Easter tree. It was something that was written by Catherine Milhouse that was awarded the Caldecott Medal in 1951. Well, you can decorate a tree not only with colored eggs, but eggs that have been painted by special designs, and it didn't matter if they were twigs or an evergreen tree or even just branches of forsythia. But if you decorated in that way, you too could have a special tree. But candy, even in my house, is one of the paramount things that I think of when I think of Easter. When I wake up, I'm always hoping that there's an Easter egg or at least an Easter bunny. But many people began to realize that the early part of the 20th century, well-known chocolate companies began to produce special confections for Easter. Schrafts had been started by Wilhelm Schraft, who had actually come from Germany in the 1860s. And by the turn of the 20th century, not only did he make chocolates, but he made chocolates was specially packaged with Easter outfits on them. You saw a bunny that might actually have a bow tie, or you'd have candy that was beautifully wrapped in Easter paper. Schrafts was a big deal, but do you remember Fanny Farmer candies? Fanny Farmer had nothing to do with Fanny Farmer, the great chef, who also wrote the Fanny Farmer cookbook. But when this company was started in the 1920s, it would have hundreds of Fanny Farmer candy stores throughout the United States. And here, wishing us a happy Easter, this couple of the 1830s in Boston happened to hold a Fanny Farmer candy box, but you can see in the distance the spire of the Old North Church. We also realized that Whitman's, something that is so popular with the Whitman sampler, was something that they too created a special chocolate just for Easter Sunday. And in this way, a woman with her beautiful hat says it's the season's most popular messenger. And the messenger, as you can see here in the foreground, does hold a box of Whitman samplers. But by that period, the very center chocolate was milk chocolate showing the messenger, my favorite piece. I always hope to get to it first. What about Easter lilies? Well, many people realize in some ways that not just the fact that tulips and hyacinths and all sorts of different flowers are given. But my very favorite are Easter lilies. Not only the aroma, but it's something we begin to realize in some ways that whether we purchase it at a supermarket, at Home Depot, or even on a corner street on the way to whatever hostess has invited us for dinner, we realize how important it is. Well, these young children are in what was the Winchester Conservatory, later to become known as the Mahoney's Rocky Ledge, which was started in Winchester, and there's one right up the street from me in Ulsterville. The young children themselves are covered on all sides with Easter lilies, and they're Gail Porter, Deborah Whitaker, and David Whitaker, all from Winchester. The photograph is 1953, but if you've ever been to conservatory greenhouses, the aroma of Easter lilies on the Saturday before Easter is just incredible. But what about Easter seals? Now, during this period, I was doing a lot of research, and of course, Easter seals is something that I had always heard of. My parents supported them. But seen here was a woman named Tenley Albright. Maybe you remember her as a champion skater. She later went on to become a well-known surgeon, and she actually did surgery at the New England Baptist Hospital. But during the period of the 1950s, she became a spokesperson for the Easter Seals, which helped crippled children, not just in Boston, but throughout the United States. And seen here, mind you, this is her 1956 Porsche 356A Speedster. She's beside a young little girl that actually is Gail Arsenault, who was that year's Easter Seals representative. And Tenley Albright herself was not only good to this little girl, taking her from various functions, but they placed an Easter Seal bumper sticker on her Porsche. But of course, Tenley Albright took her job very seriously. You have to realize this was a champion skater, but she later was graduated from Radcliffe and later the Harvard Medical School. During this period, and this is 1957, she's a representative of the Easter Seals, where she began an Easter Seal campaign in 1957. The woman on the right is Ruby Graham, and she was a well-known fashion director of the Millinery Institute of America. And she won the prize, which was an Easter bonnet in this box that Tenley Albright handled. So Easter Seals, an Easter bonnet, and of course, doing good, in this instance for handicapped children, was something that Easter Seals was associated with as Easter. But if we think about it, and we go back in our memories, not only to our parents and grandparents, Easter Sunday dinner was something that was always special. Not only were there treats, things that we basically only had once a year, but whether it was turkey or ham or lamb, we realized that the quintessential ideal, much like Norman Rockwell's freedom from hunger, was something that we realized that many people would enjoy a dinner. They might enjoy an Armour Star ham. My father was a vice president of Armour when it was known as Chamberlain. Chamberlain later was bought out by Armour and became known as Armour Chamberlain, moving from the South Market at Quincy Market to Dorchester Southampton Street. My sister and I were guinea pigs. We were always fed the different types of things that they were innovating, such as cheese-filled hot dogs or Easter hams that had already been pricked with small forks and cloves placed into it. So in some ways, Armour Star ham, which was actually done for the 75th anniversary of Armour, was something that you too could serve to your family and friends. Other people might like a roasting chicken. And seen here, this was an Easter salute to the noblest roaster of them all. Not only did Birdseye provide all of the frozen vegetables, but you realize that a chicken, something that FDR would say would be in every pot on a Sunday, might be your choice for Easter Sunday dinner. But who could forget the French chef? I had a great aunt that if you dared to bother her between 4 and 4:30 in the afternoon, could actually give you the wrath of God from her eyes. The French chef taught Bostonians not only all the intricacies of cooking à la Française, but she actually seemed to decipher it in a very understandable manner. Seen here, she's got a series of chicken in the foreground. I guess the one in the very center is Mr. Chicken, Mrs. Chicken, and the baby chickens on either side. But the French chef was somebody in a lot of ways that not only had shows that showed how to make a leg of lamb for Easter, as well as a ham, but her Easter chickens were well known. I loved this picture when I found it, and it showed a little girl in her straw Easter hat staring at her dinner plate with a slice of ham, 2 yams, and peas, holding a glass of milk. Her eyes look surreal, like she's never seen ham before, but on the other hand, many of us were equally joyful on Easter Sunday, seeing family and friends, and we realized in some ways what a special day it really was. Dessert could be a plethora of things. When I was a child, being half Italian, we had all sorts of different treats, and we realized that pizza gaina, which is a delicious cheese and meat bread, as well as Easter egg bread that had eggs in the dough itself, as well as cannolis, spaghettellas, and all sorts of different things. But this was an Easter egg cake you could make with Baker's unsweetened chocolate. And it was simple to do and easy to decorate with Baker's chocolate frosting and, of course, jelly beans. Another might be Dorothy Duff's gingerbread gingermen. Duff's mix was one of the well-known mixes of the 1920s and 30s. You simply added water or milk and an egg, and you could actually make gingerbread. Seen on the left-hand side, Dorothy Duff was an extremely well-known, and her husband's family had marketed this company to actually sell these gingerbread mixes along with cornbread and many other types. So you had a wonderful selection of meats and vegetables and sweets. But so too, looking at this Easter Day parade in 1972, we could have snow, maybe we will this year, but in this instance, we see not only young children and her father, along with family and friends following after religious services on the Commonwealth Avenue Mall, but we realize in some ways that it's even the wonderful ducks done by Mrs. Schoen on the Boston Public Garden. Nancy Schoen is a well-known sculptor, and many of her animal sculptures are not only in Boston, but throughout the United States. This was done by Robert McCluskey's book, Make Way for Ducklings. And of course, who do we see? We not only see the mallard family, but we see Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, along with Mrs. Mallard. Each one of them have their Easter bonnets, and their little walkway is lined with beautiful baskets of small jonquils. Well, Easter traditions in Boston is truly something that is both religious and secular, but it's something that is a shared tradition that you and I share. Whether our families were Roman Catholic or Protestant, we realize in some ways the Christian tradition of the rising of Jesus Christ from the dead is something that we worship and we accept as fact. But we also begin to realize that by the 19th century, the religious traditions began to subtly give way to a secular tradition. And today, though many of us realize the importance of the day, it's also something that children gleefully wait for, and with their baskets filled with not just colored eggs, chocolate Easter bunnies, but of course that ubiquitous plastic straw is something that many people realize that it's a tradition. These books are done not just for us so that we can remember, but they're also done for our grandchildren who sometimes don't understand the joys of the 1950s and 1960s, that they were times when they were different, simpler, and of course, family-oriented. I think in some ways that each of these books, so whether it's the Christmas traditions in Boston, Thanksgiving traditions in Boston, and now Easter traditions, and as I said, Valentine's Day and Halloween traditions in Boston will be published next year are a great way for us to realize in photographic format how much we share and how much we realize these holidays are so important. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.
Anthony, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Could we ask you to stop screen sharing?
All right.
And then we'll take some questions if anyone has any. And I thought you said something about Easter bonnets.
Yes.
So I figured I'd put mine on for the occasion.
Oh, that's awesome.
Dickens.
Yeah, that's
That's
lovely.
beautiful.
Gosh.
All right, anyone have any questions?
No, this,
Well, you know-
everything is wonderful.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you, Angela. I'm looking forward to coming back in person. I said the other day to Jean, I said, not only is it a welcoming group of people, but it's also the best eats of any place I give a lecture. So I think in a lot of ways, our camaraderie is something that I miss. It's been a year and I've really gone nowhere. So it's something I hope that will come back maybe in the fall, so long as we're all safe.
Right.
Anthony, can you tell us a little bit about a special trip you've got coming up?
Well, you know, I don't know if anybody realized, I'm not a historian and I don't just teach college. My career has been as an accountant for years. So for the last 35, 40 years, I've been an accountant for 2 different companies and I'm semi-retiring. And it's a nice feeling. I never thought I would do it. I do teach at Boston University and I still teach at the University College of Boston. But I decided that since I travel so much, when I can, of course, I haven't with COVID, I would sponsor a trip. And this coming fall, I'm sponsoring a trip to Italy. It's not one of those trips that you have, 7 nights, 7 cities. We're going to southern Italy and we're staying in Sorrento and we have one hotel. And from there, we actually do day trips. We go to Capri one day, Istria another day, Avellino. We have a barbecue on Mount Vesuvius, and we do various trips that are more historical, but I explain them as to what they represent. So if you've been to Italy, you know it's a wonderful thing. It's a 4-star hotel. It's actually something that has wonderful food because we've stayed there twice. But it's also the fact in some ways that it's a fun group of people. There's 20 people that actually signed up.
Unavailable to take your call at present time. If you leave a message.
For God's sake.
So I think in a lot of ways, if people are interested, you have my name, check me on Facebook, and I'll send you the itinerary. It's really a nice trip, and it's not so much walking. We have a luxury coach, and then usually we do it 10 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, enough time to go home at the hotel, shower, shave, and get ready for dinner for a drink. And the hotel overlooks the Bay of Naples. So it's a great trip and very nice.
That's what attracted me, was the fact that it was one hotel. Because when I went to Italy, we were there for 10 days and we're in 4 or 5 different hotels. So we were packing, it was a little much. I was exhausted.
See, I like to have a place that I can actually have flowers and a fruit basket, all from these little markets. And I like a drink sometimes before dinner. So I like to know that I'm going to be at one place and enjoy it. But if people do have questions, by all means, I'll be there to answer them. But do go onto Facebook and even take a peek. Even if you're not interested, I'll send you the itinerary just so you can see. Next year I'm going to be doing Ireland. So I'm going to try to do one a year. And I thought, what a fun thing to do. I mean, sometimes it's hard for some of us. We've either lost our partner or in some ways we don't want to necessarily travel alone. But I hope in some ways, and I don't get any pay for this, by the way, I do this in a way that it makes it seem like a group of friends. And whether or not we're friends before we meet, we'll be friends after we leave one another. So that's what it's all about. So it's like history. And look at what Jean does. I mean, yeah, every time I go onto Facebook, I see all the different things that she's doing. So if I can do a little bit on history and a little bit on travel, these books are great, but I'm looking forward to getting away, and I hope I can. Does anybody have any questions or comments, though? Or?
I actually have a comment. I wanted to tell people that Anthony has got a Facebook page called Lost Boston.
Yes.
So if you want to see some really cool images of Boston through the years with great, descriptive information, check out that page.
Thank you. It's fun. I post normally every day, sometimes every other day, but I have 19,000 members on it. So it's a fun group of people, and I've made friends with some people that I had never known before. So it'd be fun.
It is. It's a lot of fun.
Well, thank you all. I think this is a great thing, and I wish you all good health, stay well, and I wish you a happy Easter.
Same to you,
Bye.
Anthony. Good
Same to
night.
you.
So much,
Thank
Anthony.
Happy
you
Easter.
again.
Good night,
Sure.
everyone.
Good
Good night.
Night,
night.
everyone.